Let's start with this case of following. If you think about it, this means that Calvin has many users he's following, which suggests a has many relationship. Let's review what we did in the last lesson in that context. So we can go here. This is what we did with user microposts. Remember that a user has many microposts, and as a result, there's this collection user.microposts. So naively, you might think, well, we're going to have the same thing here. A user might have many users they're following. Here, each row in the following table has the follower ID, the followed ID, and then name, email address, and all the other information for the user. But if you think about this, it's incredibly redundant because all of the information here is already in the users table. And indeed, going the other way, doing something like Hobbs.followers would involve the same sort of redundancy. And finally, it's a maintenance nightmare because if a user changed their name, say here, user2 changed their name, we would have to update that name everywhere in every table. So what we'd really like is to maintain the current users table the way it is and have all this information be in only one place. This suggests that we're missing an underlying abstraction, and the way to figure it out is to think in terms of the REST architecture. Remember, the REST architecture involves resources that are created, updated, shown, destroyed, and so on. So what happens when one user follows another user? What's being created? Fundamentally, what's being created is a relationship between the two users. So in this section, what we're going to do is build a relationship model that captures that idea. Some websites have relationships between users that are symmetric. For example, Facebook, where users are friends, and if Calvin is friends with Hobbs, then Hobbs is also friends with Calvin. But these Twitter-style relationships are asymmetric. Absent some sort of blocking mechanism, Hobbs doesn't choose who follows him, but he does choose who he follows. So in this context, if Calvin is following Hobbs, but not vice versa, Calvin has an active relationship with Hobbs because he's actually taken action to do the follow, whereas Hobbs has a passive relationship with Calvin because he hasn't made any choice. The way we're going to model this is with what's called has-many-through. Let's take a look at that. This is modeling the idea of a user here named after me who's following a bunch of different users. So this is user.following over here with the IDs of the users. But this user.following collection is calculated through what's called a join table, in this case called active relationships, that has a list of all of the follower IDs and a list of all the followed IDs. So the way has-many-through works is for a particular user, it goes in and says, well, which of these active relationships have a follower ID equal to the current user's ID? And once it's made that list, it can then figure out what the user.following array should look like using has-many. Later on in this lesson, in order to construct user.followers, we'll have a corresponding passive relationships table. But if you think about it, that's going to be exactly the same information with just follower ID and followed ID reversed. As you might guess, Rails has a way of handling this. Indeed, what we're about to do is create a generic relationships table, and then we'll be able to switch between active relationships and passive relationships inside of the user model. So let's generate a model for those relationships. Take a look at a diagram here. We'll have the ID and the magic columns as usual, and then we'll have the follower ID and followed ID corresponding to these two columns here. Remember, it's singular though, Rails generate model relationship. Again, looking at our diagram, there are going to be two fields, a follower ID and a followed ID, each of which will be an integer. When we generated the micropost model, we used user ID references, and that automatically built part of the data model. But here, follower ID and followed ID both refer to users. So we're going to have to build the data model by hand. We're going to have to tell Rails in particular which class this corresponds to. Let's take a look at the migration. We're actually going to make a couple changes. So this is fine so far as it goes, but we're going to be finding by follower ID and followed ID, and in fact the combination of the two should be unique. Right? A user shouldn't be able to follow a user twice. And all of those requirements suggest a database index. As we saw in the micropost migration right here, we can add an index on a particular column just by writing index true, like this. And then we want a multiple key index on both of them, enforcing uniqueness. So that was this here, maybe? Yeah. So we want a combination of this add index, to users. No, this is actually to the relationships table, right? And we want it to be composite, so a combination of follower ID and followed ID. We saw this before. Or was it right here? So we combined a bunch of different things from previous migrations to make this one. And so this line will arrange for an error to arise if, for any reason, we try to create a duplicate relationship. Let's save the file here and run the migration.